Hi, everybody, and welcome. I'm Beth Holland from EdTech Teacher, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. And I'm thrilled to be joined tonight by Jodie Deinhammer, whose last name I just realized I might have mispronounced. And
No,
is that good?
yeah.
Okay, and Lawrence Reiff, who I also may have mispronounced, and Shawn McCusker, who I will not mispronounce tonight. And so this is going to be a great webinar bringing in these three excellent educators, and we are going to ask them every hard question we could possibly think of over the next hour about ways to really leverage technology to improve student learning in the classroom and deal with every test that may come your way. So we're thinking about, New York Regents exams, and Jodie's got the Texas tests, and there's Common Core and SATs and APs and all these wonderful things that can potentially get in the way, and yet here are three experts that are not letting it get in the way. So we've got questions that we can hammer them with, and I'm going to use that word fondly throughout today. Also, for those of you just now joining us, again, there is a chat box. So if you can please introduce yourselves in the chat, and throughout this conversation, if you have really tough questions or easy questions, please go ahead and share those, and I will make sure to pass them along to our speakers. But with that, I'll say ladies first, and I'll let Jodie introduce herself, and then we'll get started.
Okay, I'm Jodie Deinhammer, and you did say it right. You're one of the few. And I teach anatomy in Coppell, Texas, which is right outside of Dallas.
Sorry, I muted myself. Great. We'll just go in order from, I'm looking at it left to right, except we just lost Shawn. Go ahead, Lauren.
Hi, I'm Larry Reiff. I'm an English Language Arts and Humanities teacher at Roslyn High School in Roslyn, New York, about a half hour east of Manhattan. Right now I'm working with ninth graders this year, but I've worked with all grade levels, 9 through 12.
Great. So we just lost Shawn. It looks like his network just oh, wait, he's coming back. So there's Shawn back again. So I'll let Shawn, perfect timing, so you can go ahead and introduce yourself as well.
Hi, I'm Shawn McCusker. I'm a social studies teacher. I'm also the department chair for social studies at Libertyville High School in Libertyville, Illinois. I do a fair amount of work for EdTech Teacher. I taught for 3 years with iPads in my classroom, and I just went to a school that uses Chromebooks. I'm in the process of finding what's universal and adjusting to what's not.
Great. Well, thanks. So again, for those of you who are just now joining us, if you can, please introduce yourselves in the chat, and don't hesitate to ask questions throughout. But with that, we're going to, like I said, lead things off. The goal tonight is to ask as many hard questions as we can. And so these really, I have to admit, are ones that have stumped me, and I would say the last 6 to 9 months, where I've been working with different teachers, and these questions have come up, and so it's kind of nice to have everything together and to be able to get some different perspectives. So the first question that I get a lot is, all three of you do amazing projects and different activities in your classrooms, and how do you balance when you're teaching, your curricular requirements and then also requirements of outside testing organizations, and so make sure that you're meeting those requirements and still be able to do all of the projects that you do, and you're engaging the students. And how are you able to make that balance? So I don't know who wants to grab that first, but go ahead.
I don't mind fielding that one. I find that the projects can be, as you pointed out, great tools for engagement, for that initial engagement, to hook them in. Especially when I look at English language arts with the coming Common Core. Some of the things I'm expected to do with a ninth grader, things like the Epic of Gilgamesh or Chaucer. How do I get a 14 or 15-year-old excited about that? Well, the technology can use as a tool for engagement to get them into it. Once I have them into it, once I have their interest, then I can begin to build those Common Core skills, and I can use the projects as kind of scaffolding to build those skills.
Let me throw out there, as you were talking, I never really framed it this way, but a lot of times the way that you craft a project is like an anticipatory set. You start talking about this thing that they get to do, this excitement that can build, this energy, and once you have them moving, then if they know that there's some learning that they need to express, and they're looking for a dynamic, exciting way to express it, and that excitement builds, then I can start really placing the skills within the lesson.
Yep.
And I think what it requires, and I'd really love to hear what the others have to say about this, I think it requires that you know your curriculum and you know what skills you want to bring out. Because when you give a student-directed project with lots of choice, you might find an opportunity to move a skill into the lesson kind of not where you normally would. So I find myself saying, oh, this has come up. I didn't plan on doing this until the next unit. Let me move this skill in because it's realistic, it's timely, and it fits naturally into this lesson. And so I think that sometimes that can be frustrating or scary to people because they're saying, it seems like you're just willy-nilly bringing these things in. But I think it really makes me know those skills, how I intend to incorporate them, and to find ways to naturally engage the students with those topics.
I agree also with all of that, but I think that strategically placing the skills into various parts of the project, the kids, if they're engaged in the project, then they're wanting to learn it, so they're more likely to listen and to try to comprehend it. But it also gives me more of a chance to figure out what they don't know, and with project base, I can kind of guide them through a path much easier than if everybody's doing the same type of assignment with the same end goal.
Mm-hmm.
I know a project that I've done with my students that I feel like might be a kind of a good example of this. We use thingling. We'll take passages out of a book, or a famous paragraph, the opening paragraphs to Fahrenheit 451, or an exchange between Romeo and Juliet, and we'll turn it into almost like an infographic, and then we'll take that and we'll use it in thingling, and we'll annotate it, based on vocabulary or what's going on. And they love it because they're using ThingLink, they're getting to find images, they're getting to find videos that go along with the text. But really, at the heart, what I'm having them practice are vocabulary and context type questions. When the author uses the word, whatever, in lines that they most likely mean, the same kind of questions they're going to face on a Regents and eventually on an SAT or ACT. So while it's this fun project where they think they're just getting to annotate this cool little picture, what I'm really doing is a vocabulary building activity about vocabulary in context. So it's one of those common core skills. They're going to be tested on it, but I can teach them that skill through the project.
That's really cool. It's funny that you mentioned ThingLink because that's one that seems to be coming back more and more. Like it goes in these waves, and then all of a sudden, all these different ideas coming back. And so, great thinking about those different tools. Shawn and Jodie, anything else in terms of, how you mentioned too, like how do you not just balancing the curricular requirements, but when someone comes in and says, well, wait a minute, you're doing this ThingLink and aren't you supposed to be doing this vocabulary? Or I see that all your kids are out making these projects, but how is that project relating back? Do you have to also do sort of like that education of your administration and of your parents to let them know like how this is all tying in together?
Well, I know for me, I think in the early days I had to, but now it's pretty much, it's almost like in my school, they'll see a bunch of kids standing in a corner in a hallway, and two will be holding up an iPad while another one's holding up a piece of tin foil to make sound effects, and people go, oh, that's something for Reiff's class. They just kind of assume, and now it's just accepted. But at first, it definitely took a lot of, we're in the 5th year now of our one-to-one iPad program. So in the early days of it, it definitely took a lot of convincing, but now it's pretty much, I think we've adjusted to it.
Yeah, I have the same kind of story. Is initially I'm in my 4th year of iPads, and the first year I had an administrator actually talk to me and say, I'm concerned about how much you're just winging it. I'm like, well, I'm not actually winging it. It's very strategically done, but I really had to convince them. But now it's like the same thing. They see my kids in the hall are doing stuff. They're like, oh, that's just for her class. So
I think what you touched upon something I was going to speak to, Jodie, the idea that being creative and allowing a departure from the specific path isn't necessarily winging it. You're saying, ultimately we want students to learn and to express that learning. And we used to do that by saying learn and express it in the form of a test, or learn it and express it in the form of a short essay, short answer, or paper. And all we're doing is taking that learning and expressing it in a different form. I don't see a video as anything less than a spoken paper. It's the expression of words. I have to say this, going back to what Beth said, what I did have to communicate to teachers or to the administration when I first started was, here is my vision, here is how this activity fits into this vision, because without connecting those, like the momentary to the long term, it looks like, it sounds like the classroom is active and engaged. Learning doesn't look like learning used to look like. Learning in rows with your head down, taking notes, diligently being quiet and watching me isn't what I'm going for anymore. So sharing that that was my vision, and then when they walk by, they can norm to what my norm is in the classroom, which is engaged, active discussion. And really, it's coming to this community learning. You know, it's this group community of learning that I've grown to. Now, having changed schools, I'll add to that I think society and education has progressed, because the school that I'm at has definitely has a lot of the understandings that we worked really hard to share early on, but they're not one-to-one yet. But they have a lot of technology prior to that one-to-one. So I think as a whole we're progressing, but there's still a lot of, it's important for teachers to communicate what that mission is. And now as somebody with supervisory responsibilities, I really go in asking my teachers, what is your vision? What are you trying to accomplish? To kind of respect the fact that of my own experience.
Thanks. I don't want to cut anyone off. Anyone else have anything to add on that one? Cool. Okay, so like I said, finding as many hard questions as possible. The next question, and this has actually come up a lot more in the last few weeks even, but you know, what's your answer if a colleague or other teachers ask, you know, what's the benefit, you know, if you're spending all this time on these projects, like how do you actually measure the benefit when you think about your test scores? And I've heard some mixed answers on that, so I'm curious what your thoughts are, that, you know, when someone comes up and says, you know, what's the bottom line is test scores, so, and you're spending all these time on these projects, like how are you measuring their effectiveness?
I'll jump in. I struggle with this with my teachers. We're working on standardized assessments for the district as part of the law changes in Illinois. But the learning has never been about the test. The test is important, but we have to place our students within that context. The goal has always been the possession of skills that will make their lives better, that will help them succeed as they go out into the world. And bubbling a test was never that answer. That was just a traditional way of us measuring and gathering easy, manipulatable data. And so the goal has always been to prepare them. If we create projects, and a project, like we said, I mentioned before, was create an idea, organize it, plan it, articulate your vision, come up with the way to communicate it, and then communicate it. I don't think we're going to fail our students if that's what we do, if that's how we articulate information. And I truly believe that if over time we can craft the culture of schools into this idea of creating meaningful products, then the testing and measurement will fall into line with the vision of schools that dominates, right? Like, testing is a traditional way of measuring learning. I think if we recreate what happens in the classroom, we can start to articulate a different way of measuring. Right now, that's tests, and we have to do our part, but I think good learning is going to help on those tests, whether it be bubbling for unit tests or creating projects and having kids in the hallway with tinfoil expressing themselves.
Well, I think that, you know, as much as, you know, I'm a big believer that, especially when it comes to English, that the mistake that we make is we'll give a kid a book, we'll read it together, and then we'll evaluate whether or not they understood that book, usually in English, by a written, you know, by an essay. And, you know, I think that we should be giving them as many outlets, as many forms to express, you know, I get it, I understand. And, you know, when you were speaking a moment ago, it reminded me of something, you know, people say to me, well, you know, how do you address the idea that, you know, well, how is this helping with the test scores? It's a similar answer that, well, I answer with the question is, why are you so focused on the test scores? Like, that's the bigger issue here, is why are we focused on test scores so much? What we should be focused on is the learning, like you were saying, the actual process of, you know, figuring out through creation. The idea that, you know, when we look at, like, Bloom's taxonomy, the highest form is, you know, creation. Let's let them show our understanding through what they can create. And in some cases, it's going to be an essay or a test. Some kids are better at the essay or the test. But for other kids, it's the video project, it's the radio play, it's the options. And I think we have to give them those options to express that understanding without really focusing on, the end result is a test. The end result is learning. The end result is enrichment. The test is just one little, speed bump along the way to that.
And the way I look at tests, and that's one of my things that when teachers ask me questions like that, how do they do on the test, or what about the test? I don't really answer that. It's more focused on why is that test so important, like you said, and trying to convince teachers that there are lots of ways to assess student learning, and through the use of portfolios or just measuring their growth over time. The test itself, to me, tells me where we need to go and what we need to do next. And so that for me to give my kids a test, it's more for my own feedback than to determine where they are and assign a grade to them.
And actually, Jodie, maybe I can start with you and then push this back, sort of like as a follow-on to that. And you mentioned portfolios, but at the end of the day, if you really were looking for, like, how do you know if your student has learned what you wanted them to learn? Because I think so often it's based on a number. We all grew up in a situation where it's like, okay, I wrote an essay or I took a test and there was a right or a wrong answer, and someone calculated a score and said, okay, here's how much you learned, 85% worth, or 92% or whatever it was. So, when we start thinking about these other opportunities and the creative problem solving and demonstrating creativity, like, these are really hard things to measure. So how are you looking at it in terms of determining whether or not your students have learned what you really wanted them to learn?
For me, I have my students actually design the class, so they decide what they want to learn themselves, and they end up creating something that will show what they've learned. And for the most part, I feel that they're learning more than I would have ever asked of them because they're interested in what they're doing. And so I'm very interested in standards-based grading, and our elementary schools in our district do that. It has not moved into the high school yet, but I'm interested in how that would make the classroom look different if there wasn't a number on it and they weren't getting a score or a grade or an A, how that would change the environment of the classroom. We have a teacher at our school that doesn't share grades with his students. He conferences with them frequently and lets them know how they're doing on the objectives, and they don't see their grade until the very end of the 6 weeks. And he got a lot of pushback on that, but his kids, after that year, had nothing but amazing things to say about the process and how much they felt like they learned and appreciated what they learned.
I would say that the best way to measure learning is to have students embody that learning in something, like manifest it, like the physical manifestation of abstract ideas, in what they do. I think that a big part of that has to do with, like, articulating not just what facts you learned, but the process through which that meta-analysis. Beth and I had a conversation about this recently, like the discussion of how you learned. So if you have students present their learning, but also debrief, I made this choice because I chose this tool to express learning because it fit most with the way that I've framed this learning. If you think about a student getting feedback on a regular classroom test, you hand back a number, and that number has meaning and weight, but that feedback means nothing. But if you have a student present their presentation to class, and then students ask them questions, and then again, I think we really learn socially. Like, knowledge is socially constructed, and so by having those debriefings and having people communicate and seeing the way that other people express, we're not just learning the factual content of what happened, we're learning multiple varying processes of learning that happen in a classroom. And so that can be hard, like you said. Like, one of the problems we look at when we say, how do you measure learning, is sometimes what we're really saying is, how do you make a product a number? How do you boil a product into 13 grades? Like, how do I sift this and slice it into place? And sometimes you can be in a class and have an amazing discussion, and you ask, did learning happen? Yes, it did. But then we stumble over how to make it a number. And so I know that that's reality, and we have to create grades. Grades are not going away anytime soon. I know that in many classes, like the example you had is a great example of that. But I think that we have to measure learning, and we have to be creative about the way we're going to take these transformative lessons and make them into grades. I think that there's a lot of room for discussion in the future about that.
Well, and just to add to that, I think one of the important things when we're doing these creative projects and how do these translate into grades? I mean, I can't stress enough when the cornerstone of as important as the creative project, it goes hand in hand with the rubric. I mean, you can't kind of do the creative project and be like, well, I like it because it looks prettier. There needs to be clear benchmarks along the way, and you can use those benchmarks to kind of fit into those state standards. And that rubric kind of lays out exactly for the kids what's expected for them. So anytime I give out any kind of creative project or any type of creative assessment, it goes hand in. I don't hand it out until the rubric's written. They have to go out together.
I would like to add to that I think it's powerful to let the students create rubrics together, right? And
well, that's exactly what we do as a class. We kind of create that rubric. I find often they'll set the bar a lot higher for themselves on a rubric than I ever would.
That's where every discussion I've ever had with a teacher who creates rubrics with their class ends in, and they set a standard far beyond what I would ask them to do.
Yeah.
And I feel like sometimes I act as a force to lower and make that expectation realistic. I will typically say a comment something like, "You only have 4 days to work on this."
Take a step back and think how much time you have for this.
Right, and then we can make realistic choices. I totally agree with you about creating a framework, but I also think that rubrics can't be checklists. We can't have rubrics that have this end point that's like a finish line where everyone stops running. It's a little bit like a race where the finish line, you're not sure if you finished until you feel satisfied that you've accomplished the task. Because I want them to push further, and if you have a student who's an excellent student who can check off that list, they're done as soon as they do. So I think I wrote an article where I mentioned that I think good rubrics have an upper level where you blow the top off that rubric. And so there's constructed walls to maintain them, and there's the minimum standard, and there's tiers to raise them higher up. But also there's this end point where you might say an A project is one that redefines the meaning of excellence for the teacher. And they can, we can have a group discussion about, what is the norm for quality in our class that adjusts with them.
And I agree with that, and I think that I have some of my rubrics, I have things like that on there where it doesn't tell them what to do, and the kids really struggle with that, and especially some kids that they can't wrap their head around what they're being asked to do, and that's the whole point, is I'm not asking them to I'm forcing them to think and to be creative and to be original, and they want the checklist, and I think that's just something that we have to fix as teachers, is to get away from that.
I actually, no, I actually had a teacher that was working with last year, and the students were, about halfway through their first year of being one-to-one with iPads, and she said, well, now I don't know what to do, because all of a sudden they're like, we're tired of doing projects, you're making us think so much, this is really hard, can't we just take a test this time? So they actually had this point where it's well, we just want the answer right now, why can't we just have the answer? That I said, well, I think that's probably a good thing.
I find that students will actually come back and ask me to lecture. Could you just lecture this lesson? And what's funny is, okay, if you're making decisions about how you want to learn now, and you're trying to balance and budget your energies and how we're going to do things, but I will, when they ask me to be specific about something, provide them with the kind of instruction they think would work. But it goes along with, like Jodie said, I want them to construct the units. And if they get to a point where they feel like, oh, I think this would be a place for some good direct instruction, I don't think that it's an invalid point. And I encourage them to say how they would like this to happen, so long as it's not about, well, this is the least engaging, lowest energy output that I can do. If it's a meaningful discussion, I will absolutely give them the kind of classroom experience that they're asking for.
There was actually Kristen Whiting, who teaches elementary school, did a great blog post last spring where she talked about, she rarely gives math worksheets, but it was just a particular day, and she handed out a math worksheet, and a little girl stood up and cheered and said, I love math worksheets. And Kristen's has this amazing inquiry-based classroom, and she says, wait, why are you cheering for a worksheet? And she said, because worksheets are easy. You don't have to think. Usually you make me explain my thinking, and it takes forever, and it's really hard, and worksheets are easy. You just fill them in really fast. Mm-hmm. So I don't think Kristen did too many more worksheets after that. Larry, did I cut you off? I thought you were about to say
Well,
something.
I was going to say, one of the things that, again, maybe this is more specific to my field in English, but whenever we do creative projects, one thing that I really stress is there's always a written component to the creative project. So, for example, today in one of my classes we finished Animal Farm, and one of the final projects we're doing for Animal Farm is they have to do the whole news report from Animal Farm, and they're going to film and use templates, reporting live from Animal Farm and go back and forth to the studio. But step one, before they're allowed to leave the classroom to film a single frame of footage, is you need to write a script. You need to go through, you need to proofread it. There's the grammar, there's that written component. It's almost, I hate to put it this way, but there's almost like you have to do the work, then you get to have the fun. And they understand that. It's part of it. And an enthusiasm goes into that work because they know what the end product is going to be. They've kind of been given this map of, like, if you do this part, then we're going to create something really cool together.
If you plan it right, the work is fun, and and they don't see it as work. Like you said, I've never seen kids like sitting in the hallway planning a script for a news broadcast where they're like, oh, the drudgery of this stuff. That's not how it comes out. But I also love that you're talking about structure and organization. That's a part of every single thing we do. Like the simplest task of studying, we sit down, we come up with a plan, we create some structure, and we set forward towards the goal that we set for ourselves. And whether that's a paper or a newscast, that the outline, in my opinion, does not exist in nature. I mean, except maybe like a menu. Like an outline is almost an unnatural act in the way that we do bullet pointing. But I think like visual outlines and flow charts, things you can create on something like a Poplet or I've seen used like on like ThingLink. Those are natural expressions of the outline that my students really look forward to engaging in. If I were to say, guess what, we're outlining today, I think that we'd all have our souls crash a little bit.
I started using sketch notes this year as a way for my kids to show their understanding, and after hearing someone speak about it at EdTech last year, and I was amazed at how many connections they could make when they had to visualize it in that way, and that's something I had never thought of or had really never even heard of, and a lot of my kids are now doing that on their own because they realized how much they learn by having to visualize their learning in that way.
And when we have these kind of discussions at conferences, I'll often have people say, "Are you saying like how dare you question outlining?" And I want to make it clear, I'm not criticizing outlining. That's important, but I think sketch notes, like you're talking about sketch notes. That's the kind of stuff that maybe 20, 25 years ago people got in trouble for writing in their notes. I remember having my notes collected and I got points off for drawing a tank when we were learning about World War II. That's just how I created a visual anchor in my notes. I see that now. But I think that what we're really talking about is not an end to the things that always used to work. It's redefining what's acceptable within those categories and allowing these tools for expression to kind of hold some of that work for the students.
I think part of it too, just to like balance off of what Oliver said, and Shawn, actually, I think you're the one that said this, and I had thought of it this way, that a lot of times with these projects, you kind of know what the end result is going to be before the kids even get there because you've been watching the process unfold along the way. Mm-hmm. And I know, I made the mistake early on. This has been like the night of me talking about all the mistakes I've made as a teacher, but this one, I did a couple of bigger projects with my kids early on. I didn't have enough checkpoints. So they had gotten so far down the road before I realized that they were, off task or hadn't met the objective. And, by having these different points, checkpoints in place to be able to say, okay, do they have the understanding of the content? Are they demonstrating, the writing skills that we want? Can they organize a plan? Can they stay on task, to actually finish a project? Because there was also plenty of projects that just didn't get done.
I'm sorry. Oh, there's a thing I've noticed going on in my classroom when we work on projects. And the term I use for it is called distract engagement, where it's kids are engaged, but because of the scope of the project, they're engaged, but they're distracted by something within the project. Perfect example is we do a lot with telegami in my classroom, and I'll have them, we're taking, say, the opening lines of the Odyssey, and we're going to turn those into this really cool telegami movie with, great images in the background, and we come up with this great plan, and I tell them all these checkpoints along the way, and we have the rubric, and then 20 minutes into the period, I'm walking around, and I get to a group, and one kid's still trying to figure out, he looks engaged from afar, he's got the app open, but he's sitting there, spending 20 minutes, how big should the gammy's head be, and what color shirt should he be wearing? Instead of really focusing on what I want him to focus on, the language, the images, things like that. So he's engaged in the project, but engaged in the completely wrong aspects of the project.
Yeah, and that's the kind of clarifying question that has to come out of that. You might say to him, what about that shirt conveys his identity? The questions that you have to bring it back
Right.
and let them focus. I mean, but I think you're exactly right. It's a different level of trying to keep their engagement on.
Mm-hmm.
It actually, back to the iPad Summit in November, Derek Willard and Matt Scully from Providence Day in North Carolina, they kept talking about the students who get the iPad eyes. He's like, you look around the room and you see they have iPad eyes, and clearly they're not quite where you want them to be, because one example they said was they looked at a young lady that had iPad eyes, and she's like, well, you mentioned this concept, so I looked it up, and then I read an article, and then I got interested, and so she'd gone off down, a path, and she wasn't completely off task, but she wasn't really with anybody either.
Beth, you were talking about you kind of know what their grade is going to be like, and I think it kind of merges what we're talking about now with what we had talked about earlier about rubrics. When you're doing a project, when we have a project and they get turned in, I know pretty much what the kid's grade is going to be in advance, because I've spent so much time working and moving around the classroom and seeing what they're doing. I've seen that whole process, and when I have a test, I am always surprised by several people in the class who their performance isn't in line with what I thought. Their test grade is way low, or their test grade is way high. I don't have a clear sense of engagement or of their understanding. But with the project, I see all along, and I have a chance to act earlier to help them. So in terms of talking about how do we measure learning, I think another good answer is frequently, personally, and not in mass. And I love that about the projects too. I feel like we're learning more because I'm way more engaged with what their understanding is of all the pieces of that process. And moving to a school where we don't have one-to-one yet, but we have tech available, I can situationally create that in class when I sign out the Chromebook carts or when we do a project. But then there's this clear juxtaposition of the two different styles of learning. And I'm really looking forward to next year when we get those devices so that I can have that more frequent check on what's going on.
And you said about how you can watch their projects and kind of see how they're doing along the way, and by the time it gets to you, you already know about where the grade is going to be. For me, I feel the same way, but I do still do some traditional testing in my room.
Definitely.
Traditional in my way, traditional. And last year I switched to group tests with open devices, meaning they can use anything at all, and they work with a partner or a group of 3 or 4 or whatever. And I just walk around and listen. And so they're actually talking about the test question. They can Google it, but if it's not a Googleable type of question, they're having to really process information. And I can't go back. Every time we give a test now, I feel I gain so much knowledge about where they are and where their misconceptions are, and I can see when a question is worded in a way that I didn't intend, and I gain so much knowledge just from doing that it helps a lot.
Before we go too far, actually, we got a question from the chat, and if one of you wants to tackle this one first, the question is, can you speak to how you respond to some of the challenges when you have students with some learning disabilities, especially those that they struggle with language processing, and so we're asking them to do projects, and yet they don't necessarily have the language skills to do it.
Well, I find that just the opposite actually happens, that there are enough tools within the technology, within the devices, to compensate. Anything from a text to speech. Instead of again, I'll post a link in a moment to a project I helped a student who was remarkably school phobic. I used to teach in our district's alternative program, and this was a student who was remarkably school phobic, who I had a relationship with, that very, very much was in fear, having panic attacks over having to do a presentation in front of her science class on an element of the day. And we figured out a way that she could do the entire presentation using the technology, using avatars without having to actually be in it. In other words, she had to do this presentation in front of a class with slides, and the technology was intimidating to her, but in the end we used the technology to make it less intimidating and still have her accomplish the project. I'll post a link to it. You can kind of see what I'm talking about.
Well, you talked about just the ability to get her through it, but I think there's a way to preserve dignity for students with learning disabilities or learning barriers. And I can also identify some that the schools don't identify, but we can address them in class, and not just for those students, for everyone. We can say, here, what is this barrier that prevents you from expressing, and how can we help you? I like to say, if a student has to come to your desk during a class, if you're teaching writing, how many times can a student come and publicly seek your help before there's a social consequence to them taking your time and asking questions? And how much judgment takes place there? But if you have either avenues for them to seek help for you, like the chat box on a Google document if they're writing, or if you have a way for them to, I've had students use Twitter to tweet at me in class because I work with high schoolers. Hey, can you come over? So I'm like, happily, my phone goes off. I see that they need help. I walk over. They can address a question, and I can answer to them. But we can also teach them how to fix it. If a student has language processing issues, they can tap a word, and the answer's there. And so the process of reading, they don't have to stop, get a dictionary, open it up, page through 500 pages. That definition just comes up. So we're streamlining the supports. We're making those supports something that the student can access themselves without having to ask and act as a disruption. So I think it empowers them to just accept the fact that they have needs, just address them, just take care of whatever they are. And I think it creates an environment of greater understanding.
I think too. Actually, I worked in a school where about 30% of our students had IEPs, and where we really focused was on how can we use the technology to make them become more independent learners. And I was actually working with a group of literacy specialists yesterday, and there was a concern about, well, if you have all of this technology, are we taking away from learning key literacy skills? And instead, I said, well, let's shift the question and say, well, how are we using the technologies to increase the access? Like, it's called an accessibility setting, not a replacement setting. But if we start thinking about how do we make content available so that it can be, it can be manipulated. Like the number of kids where if they could just make the text bigger, they might be able to read it and space it out, or change column widths, or if they could, like Larry,
background color.
Yeah, change color, text to speech. Or I had so many students who had output challenges. Like if you could ask them a question, they would talk to you for 2 hours, but if you put a pen in their hand or make them stare at a blank screen to type or anything else, you couldn't do anything. So how can we look at using things like audio recording so they can play themselves back and then listen to themselves and start to go, oh wait, those are my ideas, now I can start to organize it. So, I think, I agree with you, it opens things up in different ways. And then, Larry, like you said too, with choice, students can now start to find ways to demonstrate their learning and take these multiple pathways to learning and find out what works for them. Like you may have that student that's incredibly artistic and could design an amazing infographic explaining everything you wanted them to know about a particular piece of literature, and yet not necessarily write a paragraph that would be a summary. And so I think it opens up those different pathways to learning and helping them to understand, well, what best supports them as learners.
And sometimes, again, finding an assessment that speaks to a student's skill or speaks to a student's desires can create that engagement, not just in the assessment, but in the material itself. And I guess what I'm thinking of is I had an experience 2 years ago with a student while at the end of reading Romeo and Juliet, a kid who completely disengaged, never turned in a single piece of work, but I knew that he got it. He understood it. He was one of those kids who could pull a C just listening to the class discussions without ever turning in any of the homework. He'd sit down. and just on his participation, he could pull a C, but would never turn in any of the actual work. And he just wasn't interested in it. And then we gave him the option in the end of the Romeo and Juliet unit. I noticed he was always he was one of these Minecraft kids, all about Minecraft, 24/7, just constantly playing Minecraft. And I gave him the option of taking textual evidence from the end of Romeo and Juliet, the description of the Capulet tomb, and in an app on his iPad called Blockify, build the Capulet tomb. And I gave them 2 weeks for this project, and I gave him this in the morning. I said to him, "Okay, Tim, I want you to try this project this morning. Come to me later today. Let me know if this is a project that you think you want to handle. You got to turn it in 2 weeks." He came to me later that day with it finished. "I'm done. Here it is. Let me show you. I've been working on it in every one of my classes all day today." Because I also had made him the promise that when we finished, I'd take him to the computer lab and we'd print it up on the 3D printer. And it was just the idea that, like, this was the first thing, the idea that he was able to use Blockify and print it up. It made him want to dive into the work and want to get involved in it. And again, not only got him excited for the assessment, but the material as well.
Can I add to that like the experience you're talking about with that student who found the something that engages him? As other people are listening to this conversation, when I didn't have iPads, I kept thinking to myself, like, I'm never going to make that transition. I'm not going to change. And that change didn't happen in a semester or just 1 year within my classroom. I think what it's important to think about is that the balance of those projects, and maybe in the more traditional ways in which your school operates, the students in my class that when they take a more traditional test or assessment that they have to do better, because there's a balance of those things. They're not beat down by the test because it's not such a huge part of the course. They do a project, they come back, they do something a little bit more traditional, something that they might have to bubble. And everyone has their opinions about how that should work, but balancing that out levels off their weaknesses. If they're not good at bubbling tests, then that's fine because they have this Blockify activity that you just had. And now he sees hope. And if they can engage and see there's this sense of hopefulness about the class because of the places where they are strong, they're going to go into the places where their strengths aren't as strong a little bit more engaged and energetic. And I think that that's a really important thing to think about in places where maybe that transition isn't going to happen or where there's a lot more convincing to make that transition take hold and expand.
I was actually thinking about one other thing. I had a student a few years ago who had Asperger's, and for him, a project was a nightmare. Like you would tell him he was doing a project, and you'd be almost on the verge of a meltdown. And he really actually liked the more traditional, structured assessment because he could do it independently, and there was no ambiguity. And so we were coming into an interdisciplinary collaborative project between math, history, and English, and it was a capstone project we did in the spring. And I sat down with the teachers and I said, what are we going to do about this child who's going to have an absolute meltdown when we present this? And the math teacher actually went out and did some great research and came back and he said, I know what we're going to do. We're going to take this student and he is going to become the expert in the one piece that is going to be like intellectually challenging for every single other group. And so he's going to be like a satellite. He's going to be the expert in this one teeny tiny piece. And then when everyone else needs that piece of the puzzle, they're going to have to go to him. And it was amazing to watch the transformation because here's a kid that hated projects, hated group work, hated collaboration. Visible meltdowns when you'd mention it, suddenly was like, I'm the expert, you have to come to me. And it's on my terms. And I have all the information. And it was great to see how we could take that situation and a student that had, those very difficult learning challenges and then suddenly use the opportunity for a project to make sure that he had both a social component and could succeed on his terms.
Mm-hmm.
Jodie, did you have anything you wanted to chime in on this or no? Or okay. Anything else, guys? If not, I got a few more fun, hard questions for you.
Send them out.
Send them out. Okay. So the next one, we've been talking sort of loosely about different tools, different apps, but when you have to choose the tools and apps that you're going to introduce to your students, knowing that you've got limited time with all of this, and actually I'm going to combine these two questions. Like you have to choose what you're going to teach, and then there's always that question of like, how do you balance or respond when teachers are saying like, I have to get through this curriculum. Like I have valuable things that I need to use my class time for, and I don't want to teach the technology. So how am I supposed to take this time to teach the tools? So how are you choosing the tools that, don't take away from teaching your class time, and then also that, have that value for your students?
I would say that we stick with about 5 tools that we use frequently, and those are our go-tos. And then all the other ones, the kids have the choice to use whatever tool they wish to create projects or whatever, but they're the ones that usually find them. And teachers ask that frequently about how do you teach technology and anatomy. I'm like, well, I really don't teach technology. I teach appropriate use of technology and how to problem solve occasionally, but I don't teach the technology. The kids really figure it, at least my kids figure it out. And they never have asked me how to use an app or anything like that. I feel like that's more something that we do for teachers and not students. But I don't really have a problem with it.
A tech integration specialist I've worked with from South Carolina, once he actually created this into an infographic that says something along the lines of, I've never handed a student an iPad and had them ask for professional development. You know what I mean? If you just give a kid, like, you give a teacher an iPad, I want training, I want this, you've got to give me leave time. So you give a kid an iPad, they said, oh, cool, I've got an iPad. So I've never really had to take time to teach technology in my class. I mean, I'll usually tell the kids, if I know we're going to be using an app the next day, I'll tell them the day before, or I'll email them the night before, and I'll say, here's a link, download it tonight. And my only instructions are real simple. Play with it. Because that's how they're going to learn the app, and they'll go in and they'll play with it. So by the time they come in the next day, it's not me teaching them the app, it's maybe me asking a question or two. I played with it last night, but there's one thing I can't figure out. So they've taught themselves the app. Right. As far as what I look for in the app, I know for me one of the biggest features is the idea that it's got to be something I can use for more than one thing. It's got to be a Swiss Army knife of apps in a way. And, that when we talk about apps, at least in my world, there's 2 different types of apps. There's apps that teach and then apps that create. So I'm looking more towards the apps that create, because the apps that teach, they serve one purpose for me. If I were to buy a Shakespeare app where it's one of the plays just in an iBook format with video or audio, that's great, but that's all that does for me is teach Romeo and Juliet, as opposed to something like iMovie. I mean, it's infinite what I could do with something like iMovie. The one thing that to me is a deal maker or deal breaker with an app is whether or not it exports to the camera roll, because again, if it doesn't get to the camera roll, it ends for me there. That's it. As opposed to, I can't get that Swiss Army effect. I can't bring it into the camera roll and then bring it into another app and then another app and bring it back to the camera roll. That's if an app just does one thing and one thing only, it doesn't appeal to me.
I like to say that there's a few things that I do. The first thing is that I don't go out and tell a student that my class is, here's 40 different apps and 40 different tools. Pick from them. What usually happens is that I will set a central path. I know what apps the school provided, and I'd say, here's how I could do this using these tools, and I'll make sure that they have a basic understanding. And then for those students who feel comfortable or like their vision brings them to another app or tool, I would never be the barrier. I would never stop a student from using a tool because I didn't understand how to use it. Because if you do that, think about what that would mean in the classroom for content. If you prevented your students from going beyond the knowledge that you as a teacher possess, then you're the barrier to learning in the classroom. So I think it's important to never let yourself be that. What I'll say is, here is a baseline. If you see a different way to do this, then you are free to go off and do that. And for me, you were talking about the photo roll. I think of it as a format. So if I'm saying I want this product to be a PDF that you're going to share with me on Google Drive, well, there's a lot of different things that can do that. You can take pictures and turn pictures into a PDF. You can do a Prezi, and the Prezi can be produced as a PDF. You can, like, any tool that produces a PDF, you're fine. So for me, it's more about, I'm going to choose a destination, and you go ahead and choose the path. And so long as you can get it to that destination, I really don't care how you get there. Kids come to school in a million different ways, down a million different streets, and then the learning happens at that destination. And that's how I see it with the projects. I also like to think about it like the project is a quilt that they're going to piece together. And there's no better teacher of tools than when you're presenting, like I was talking about, the community aspects of the work that you do. When students are discussing their work, they're going to be like, how did you do that? How did you slow that down? How did you blur it out? How did you change how did you make it black and white? And then the students will share in the presentation of their work when we're consuming their products. And then the next time you're going to see those ideas. It's like the meme of construction produced, and then it expands until it's in all of your work. The last thing I'll add to this is that I always name an app captain when they master something, so that one student is the master of that tool. And so when they're coming to me and say, I need you to help me with X app, I'm the content expert in the class. If I can have another student, somebody who gets their work done quickly, or really they're bolstered and developed as a human being by being asked as an expert about that, I'll do that so that I can focus on the content. And then once I see that that's nailed down, we can talk about the technology.
Sorry, I was coughing. I muted myself. It's interesting that we were just having that conversation, because I just noticed on one-to-one iPad chat they were having the same conversation. So I said, well, you need to come watch these responses when you're done. And I think, I want to add in, one last piece too. I've been working a lot more with, we've talked a lot about iPads and camera rolls, and I've been working more with Chromebooks lately. And I think, one of the big thing there when we're looking at how to work with things is, again, that just like Larry said, like, what's the pathway? Like, can I create something in one place and then ultimately get it somewhere else, so that there isn't a finite end to the creation process? And like, how many ways can I can I get about it to get to that different end? And I think that makes such a big difference, because I know the different tools that I look at has shrunk over time because of what still has that pathway. So we only have a few minutes left, so the last question I have for you guys really is just more of a show and tell. Like, with all of this talk, like, knowing that you're able to to reach all of these ends, is there a project or a unit or an activity that you think is just this amazing example of what students can achieve, or one where you set it up as an example and went, wow, I can't believe that they actually did this and met all of my other requirements? So.
I have one that my kids did last year. I let them, like I said, they kind of designed the course and the projects, and I posed the question to them it's anatomy class, and what do you think is more of a world problem, hunger, starvation, or obesity? And then we had lots of talks and things like that, and how can we solve one of these problems? And they ended up creating a course in iTunes U to educate people on healthy lifestyle choices. And within that project, it took us an entire year, but everything they created for small projects could be published into our course. And before publication, made them do a peer review. So they had to get up and share what they did. And like Shawn was saying, their kids were like, wait, what app did you use to do that? How did you blur him out? And how did you do this? And then they would all instantly, can we have a couple more days? I want to make some changes before it's due. And they would try so hard to create this amazing material, and they were learning so much. And at the end of the year, when they reflected on the project, they had like 3 or 4 different kids call me sneaky, and I asked them, elaborate please, and they said, you just made this class feel like it was fun, but now I realize you were like being really sneaky and teaching us this whole time, and now I know about copyright and how to take care of myself and all of these things that I feel like they learned so much more than I even intended them to learn.
I love that you brought up copyright, because I've never effectively taught copyright and why it's important to plagiarize like I did the second my students were like, can I use this though? But can this person use my piece of work? We had really good discussions about that. Sources became the currency of my class in the world history classes I taught with technology, because you had to know, because it mattered. Like, you didn't want to have somebody knock your project. It's out there for everyone to see. So I thought that was a really good point. The projects for me that I think work the best are the ones where I really involved a lot of choice. I had an industrial philosophers project where I created this a choice board. So the students had all these different places that they could choose, and I always give them the option B. Here's all these ideas that I have, but if you want to create your own, come and talk to me, and we'll construct that into my plan. So your outlandish idea can become a great project. There's nothing better than having students get applauded for their work. And when a class applauds for your students, that's one thing. But when society applauds for it, when I get retweets of them, students will follow their assignments tweeted on Twitter, and like, oh, it got 5 retweets, Mr. McCusker, that's amazing. Or, I have one student, I'm blown away by how it keeps growing. But if you search her video on Google, her video about Karl Marx and Adam Smith has got 75,000 views now. It's picking up about 5,000, 6,000 views a month. It has like 350 comments on it. We never could have predicted that happened. I just wanted this girl who didn't talk very much to the class to be able to, I wanted the class to hear her voice. And what I thought was going to apply to 30 people in one class or maybe 100, now way beyond my expectations, and now 3 years after it's been turned in is still going strong. And I want that. I want that kind of a voice for my students. So those are the products that excite my class and I feel are valuable to both me and my students and society, really.
And I think for me, I guess the unit that I'm most proud of is the work I've done with Romeo and Juliet, and especially Shakespeare units and stuff like that. The idea that the letters I get back, the emails I get back from the when I've done ninth grade Romeo and Juliet, or when I've done Hamlet with them in 12th grade, and they're now seniors in college or they're in grad school, and they tell me that they still remember those projects that we did, or they still look back at those projects, and that up until then they thought Shakespeare was boring. And to me, that's like the greatest compliment any of them can give me. The idea that I've inspired them and created this lifelong curiosity about Shakespeare, and they email me back the papers they've written in college about Shakespeare, and they say, I remember when we talked about this theme in your class, or when we did this project that focused on this idea. So for me, I guess being able to take what most students, think back to your own experiences with Shakespeare in high school. For most of us, it probably wasn't a pleasant experience. And the idea that I've been able to take this unit and kind of make it, one thing, the one thing that they really remember from high school is, that experience with Romeo and Juliet in ninth grade. That to me is the best feeling in the world.
Absolutely.
Thanks, guys. I'm going to let Larry take the last say on that. We've only got a minute or two left, because that really is, I think, what we're all after. And I mean, Shawn, I think you're the one who said it, that no kid ever looks back and goes, yeah, my favorite thing was that worksheet. But to think about, what are those things that have meaning and that really allow them to start to construct their own knowledge. And so I thank all of you for doing that. One thing, speaking of projects, I do want to let everyone know, and I'm going to share my screen for a second, is at EdTech Teacher, we've actually been trying to put together a book, and this is, Shawn gave us the, we'll credit Shawn, gave us the license to be able to ask his question of, what does awesome look like? And we wanted to be able to say, we wanted to create a teacher activity book of awesomeness. And so volume 1 will actually be published next week when I'm done editing and putting it together. That we've already collected a number of fantastic ideas for educators, but it's still open, because what we realize is that there's still a lot to contribute. So we'll do a volume 2 and maybe a volume 3. But if you do want to contribute your ideas, we're using Book Creator, which works on iOS and Android. And it says, a teacher activity book for iPads in the classroom, but we've actually also got some ideas for other, for other devices, and to be able to start to talk about it. So it's ettipads.org/awesome, and you can get some more information there. And this is in the little slides below the video. The other thing to let you know about is next month, Shawn and Jodie and myself will be in San Diego for our next San Diego iPad Summit, and there's still some space, and we're really sad that Larry can't come join us, because
Sorry.
It will be warmer in San Diego than in New York. So hopefully we can get him another time, but the 3 of us will be there. And then also, we just opened this today. I should change that picture. It's no longer coming soon. We have opened up our EdTech Teacher Summer Workshop schedule. We're going to be in Boston, Chicago, Atlanta. We're calling it San Francisco Bay because it's in Menlo Park, which is sort of near Silicon Valley, and I can't identify it without looking on a map. And we'll be in Los Angeles. So we've got, I think, 20 different topics on all kinds of things, from iPads to Chromebooks to creativity and project-based learning and teaching English with technology, and you name it, we've got it. So hopefully that website is now up and running as of today. So if you're looking for more ways to get hands-on and meet lots of cool people, hopefully you will come join us. So that was sort of the last little pitch of things that are going on. We do have another webinar on, I believe it's the 28th. We're taking next week off, and it's going to be talking more about like the future of technology and preparing for higher ed. And Justin Reich, who's one of our co-founders at EdTech Teacher, and Saba Kiwai from out at USC are hosting two college professors, Dean Flores and Warren Weichman. I hope I just said that correctly. Anyone knows otherwise, feel free to correct me. But they're going to be talking about sort of the impact moving, further up and like what's it looking like at that higher ed chain. So hopefully you can join us. But otherwise, I'll let everyone else say goodnight. Thank you so much, Jodie and Shawn. And
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have
Good
a
night.
good night.
all right. Good night, everybody. Thank you so much.